I want to spend a little bit of time. I was tasked with really sort of making the linkage between transportation, transit operating systems across the country and climate change and our climate change policy, which has been in the news of late, especially out here in Washington, D.C. I want to do just a quick exercise with folks in the room and ask how many of you, and there's a prize for this, right? How many of you know what the current average gas price is across the nation today? 260? You would be off.
270?
270? You would be off too.
292.
284. You could get the prize. You're a little closer. It's 284. That's according to the AAA average standard. And that has been creeping up in the last couple of days. And the reason I make that linkage is that we just about a year and 2 months ago were at a high of $4.14 as the average gas price in this country. And what that did was it drove many of our fellow citizens in this nation to actually get on the bus, to get on the train, to get to where they had to go. And that ridership, one of our colleagues from ATU was talking about earlier, was really a significant turning point for us as a nation. It was a significant turning point because many people who had sneered at the people who rode public transit, many people who had sneered at the people who rode public transit, were now joining the ranks of public transit riders. And why were they joining those ranks? They were joining those ranks out of necessity because people were feeling a particular pinch in their pocket. They were recognizing that an effective economic solution was to get on the bus, to get on the train, and to partake in the public transit movement, as we like to call ourselves, right? And the reality is that while people were also sort of softening the blow of that particular pinch on their pockets, they were in many respects also effectively doing a good green turn every single time they passed through a fare box or a transit system. This is really something that we wanted to sort of focus on today in terms of the remarks that I was going to bring to you. That really, in terms of providing solid operating assistance for transit systems across this country, is not just about making sure that those transit operating systems will be there when, make sure it's not about if, make sure we're all clear about that, when gas prices continue to rise. The cost of a barrel of oil today, according to the Wall Street Journal, is about $80 a barrel, right? And so it's expected to head higher, and we know that gas prices are not going to likely retreat, but they're going to continue to rise. And we may have momentary respites from that, but we are on a trajectory where gas prices are going to continue to rise. So the point here is that not only will funding operating assistance actually provide an opportunity for those transit systems to be in good working order, yes, that's the capital part, and that's really important, and we know that there's a real challenge about that, but when we talk about operating assistance, we're really talking about making sure that the bus drivers get paid, that the mechanics get paid, that the buses can actually run on time, and that the employees have good health care benefits, and that there is enough money to keep the systems in good administrative order. And that's not only about making sure that those systems are there when we make an investment nationally in operating assistance, it's also about creating good climate policy in our nation. It's also about recognizing that those very same communities that are transit dependent, that are vulnerable and on the front line for their transit operating systems to be infused with cash and require that cash in order to keep them operating, whether it's 24 hours as it's the case in New York City, or whether it's sometimes even shorter periods of time than that in other places. Those investments are also good climate policy investments. And why is that critical? Because those communities that are also transit dependent, that are low-income communities, that are some of the vulnerable communities that our organizations organize and represent with, and really encourage them to engage in this dialogue around saving transit fares. Those are also the same communities that are on the front line of impacts from potential climate catastrophe. And I hate using sort of catastrophic terms when I talk, but to be clear, even if we're not talking about climate catastrophe, these are the communities that are on the front lines. And that's not me, Cecil Corbin Mark, Deputy Director of We Act for Environmental Justice, saying that. That is really the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change saying that. That is, leaders in the scientific community around the world that have said the most vulnerable communities, not only the poorest of the poor around the world, but the poorest of the poor in the most prosperous societies are the ones that are going to be on the front line of climate change. I think it's really important to also recognize that there is this, we're in Washington, D.C., and we're in the midst of a place where policy is actually made every single day. And sometimes that policy is helpful and sometimes it's hurtful. One of the things currently that the federal law doesn't allow agencies such as the MTA in New York City, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, to do is to use federal dollars to properly fund operating costs. This does force some states to come up with revenue from other sources, which negatively impacts the daily lives of transit users nationwide. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that states at this particular point, in many instances, are on the brink of collapse. How many of you, by show of hands, are from California in the room? I promise, I said it wasn't the last exercise, but I lied. Forgive me. How many of you are from New York in the room? Okay. How many of you are from any state in the Great Lakes region? Okay. All of those states, the Great Lakes region, New York and California, as well as many other states, as you all probably know from sort of following this in the news back in your home states, are on the brink of some serious economic trials. And if they aren't on the precipice of those, it's coming fast. And one of the things that I think that we have to recognize is that nationally this is a problem that we need to solve. Nationally, creating operating assistance funds is something that will help relieve some of the economic pressure that is being felt in many states as well. For us in states to have to come up with either fewer resources, not saying that we should be off the hook for reordering our financial systems for how we support transit at the state level, but recognizing that we may not be able to do as much as the federal government policy of not allowing operating assistance, operating dollars to be used, not allowing agencies to use federal dollars to properly fund operating at this particular point, really creates this problem that is creating enormous economic pressure on states at this time. I think that we have an opportunity with the reauthorization coming to address this issue. And again, I say that it is not just about creating good operating transit systems, making sure that they're available, making sure that we are doing something that strikes an effective blow for the economic crisis that many states find themselves in. But it's also about, as I said, really addressing this issue of climate change as well. I think that without boring you with some of the statistics about what the scientists say and the particular burdens that some communities are already experiencing, the early effects of climate change, I would just want to close out and leave you with this thought. I think that there are few times in our sort of history as a nation that we are able to sort of really radically reform or effectively reform. Sometimes the word radical is a little scary for people, so I'll retract that word. But to effectively reform our policy frameworks to do sort of good. And I think this is an opportunity that we're presented with to really have a triple bottom line impact on our nation. Again, I think by funding operating assistance, as you've heard my colleagues talk about, it's going to save transit. It's going to make sure that transit is there in the face of rising gas prices. It's going to make it possible for those folks who weren't regular transit users, when they need to turn to transit in that particular pinch in their pocket, that transit operating system will be there. Secondly, I think it does really help us relieve some of the economic pressure on states to come up with financial solutions to solving the problems of creating a more stable financial system for operating assistance. And then thirdly, as I said, every time somebody puts a fare into the fare box and boards a transit system, they are actually really doing something for our climate policy by taking greenhouse gases out of the air, by reducing the number of cars on the road, by actually reducing some of the wear and tear on roads, and a number of other ways in which it is possible to make this investment count as a greenhouse gas policy for our nation.